Have you ever thought, in just a moment, your seemingly perfect life can be shattered just because of a small doubt? Alexander Cole, a successful billionaire, a man everyone admired, a devoted father, he had it all: money, fame, power. But one evening, when he returned home earlier than planned, he saw something that made his heart clench. An image, a voice, a seemingly harmless detail aroused in him his deepest fear of betrayal, fear of losing the only person who made his home laugh again. Do you have the courage to trust your heart when your mind screams that someone is lying to you? If it were you standing between love and doubt, what would you choose? Today's story is not just about one rich man. It's about all of us people who have lost faith and then realize that sometimes true miracles come from a sincere look, a timely apology, and a heart that dares to love again. Join me on Alexander's journey, where a cold house transforms into a house of light, and see what makes him unable to believe his eyes. If you believe that every heart deserves to be loved, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can go through this story together. Seattle mornings often begin with a thin layer of fog, drifting slowly across Puget Sound like a pale gray silk scarf. From his wall-sized window, Alexander Cole looked out at the water, where the lights of the docks still twinkled. Below, the city was waking up a stream of cars streaming in like a stream of light. In the hillside mansion, there was only silence. He once believed he had it all: a multi-million-dollar home with a heated pool, a winding steel staircase, a glass ocean view, a billion-dollar tech company. But now, all that was left was an empty shell. What he had lost was something no amount of money could buy his beloved wife, Sarah. A year had passed since she'd left in the car accident. But in this house, everything had stopped at that moment. The thin coat she'd always worn still hung behind the door. The family photo on the fireplace was still in the same place. His 3 children, Ethan, Liam, and Ellie, seemed to have learned silence from their father. They ate breakfast with spoons tapping on bowls, eyes downcast. No one speaking to each other. Alexander wasn't a bad father. He just didn't know how to move on. In the first months after the funeral, he buried himself in work, held all-night meetings, slept in the office, and used the excuse of building a future for his children. But he knew he was running away. He was afraid to go home, afraid to walk down the long hallway and not hear Sarah's laughter, afraid to open the bedroom door and still smell her scent on his pillow. One Monday morning, his personal assistant reminded him, "Mr. Cole, today's meeting schedule is tight. I'll have the car ready by 7. He just nodded, adjusting his tie. Everything in his life was as precise as a formula. But even when it was perfect, it was still empty. In the dining room, Ethan sat with his arms crossed. The 10-year-old looked like his mother, his eyes bright but sad. Liam, 8, always looked at his brother before doing anything, as if afraid of making a mistake. Ellie, 6, held her spoon but didn't eat. Alexander looked at his 3 children and saw himself in their eyes, silent, exhausted, and lost. He tried to smile. "Breakfast okay, honey?" No one answered. There was only the sound of the spoon falling from Ellie's hand and hitting the table. She whispered softly, "I miss you, Mom." The sound was so small it seemed to disappear into the air, but it pierced straight through his heart. He sat still, not knowing what to say. After dropping his son off at school, Alexander arrived at work, walking through a glass hallway lined with dozens of bowing employees. He returned the polite smile, his CEO face calm and unbroken. But inside, he was just exhausted. He wondered if Sarah were still alive. What would she think when she saw him like this that night? He came home late. The house was still lit, but there was no warmth. The candles in the living room had gone out, leaving only the smell of cold wax. He walked through the playroom. The toys were still in their places, untouched. He turned on the light and looked at the unfinished drawings on the desk, a man and 3 children. But the woman's place was left blank. Under the drawing, scrawled words read, "Mom, come back soon." Alexander took a deep breath and clenched his fists. He didn't cry. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to. In the bedroom, the wind blew in through the window, making the wedding photo sway. He held the frame, and Sarah's eyes looked at him soft, warm. "I tried," he whispered, "but I don't know how to hold them anymore." The wall clock ticked. Each tick a reminder time was passing, but the pain remained still. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Outside, the city was still brightly lit, but in the house on the hill, there was only one rich man, surrounded by the silence he himself created. And he had no idea in just a few days, a strange woman would walk through this door, awakening his sleeping heart, and making him realize there are things that cannot be bought with money, can only be kept with love. The day Mrs. Pierce entered the house. The atmosphere was thick. She carried a black suitcase. Her face was stern, her back straight as a ruler. Her silver hair was neatly tied up. Her eyes were cold as steel. Alexander stood in the hall, shaking her hand with a polite smile. He did not know that this seemingly reasonable choice would make the house more stuffy than ever. Mrs. Pierce had worked for many prominent families. Her record was impeccable. Her references were good. That was enough for Alexander. He wasn't looking for someone to share the house with, just someone who would keep the house neat, orderly, and punctual like a company. "I need someone who is trustworthy and disciplined," he said simply. She nodded, her voice as hard as stone. "I can't stand mess, sir." The first morning, everything went exactly as she had promised. The curtains were drawn, the floors were shiny, the dishes were neatly arranged, the kitchen smelled of soap and metal. But the smell, though clean, was cold. Alexander didn't notice any difference, just that everything was all right. He left home early, returned late, as usual. It was only when the 3 children began to change that he realized something was wrong. Ethan became quieter. Liam became shy, always looking around before doing anything. And Ellie, the youngest, stopped singing the songs their mother had taught her. The house was still perfect, but the sounds of childhood were gone. One evening, Alexander came home late, a light rain falling outside the window. He took off his tie and walked into the living room, only to hear a crash and a scream from downstairs. He stopped. There was the sound of glass shattering and Ellie's muffled sobs. His heart clenched, and he hurried down the stairs. The scene that appeared stunned him. The transparent glass vase shattered on the floor, the perfume spilled everywhere. Mrs. Pierce stood in the middle of the room, her face red with anger. The 3 children stood against the wall, trembling like 3 little birds. Ethan shielded the 2 children, his eyes hard with fear. "Mrs. Pierce growled, each word like a knife. "Do you think this is a playground? This vase is worth more than $5,000. You rich kids don't know how to appreciate it." Liam stammered. "We were just playing." The cat knocked over the vase. "Shut up," her voice thundered. "Don't blame the cat. You're spoiled." Alexander stood there, his chest heaving. He saw Ellie's face wet with tears, her lips trembling. When Mrs. Pierce pointed at her daughter and said in a high-pitched voice, "If your mother were alive, she would be ashamed of you," he could no longer contain himself. His voice rang out, low and cold enough. She turned, a little startled. "Mr. Cole, I just wanted to shut up." He stepped forward, his voice breaking, uncontrollable. "You can't say that. Never speak of their mother that way. Mrs. Pierce paled and stepped back. The three children looked at their father, frightened and surprised. Ethan held his brother's hand tightly, but his eyes sparkled for the first time in months. He'd seen his father on their side. Alexander turned to Mrs. Pierce. "Pack up. You leave my house tonight." She opened her mouth and stammered a few words of protest, but his gaze silenced her. 10 minutes later, the heavy sound of wheels rolling on the stone floor was heard. The large door closed, leaving an eerie silence in the house. Ethan turned and whispered, "Thank you, Father." But Alexander didn't answer. He just looked at the broken glass on the floor, reflecting his face. A hard, cold face, no different from Mrs. Pierce's earlier. He silently picked up the broom and swept the floor, each movement slow. The three children sat by the stairs, watching. Each time the broom touched the stone floor, the sound was like a knock on his heart. As he gathered the last pieces, Ellie came softly closer, placing her tiny hand on his. "Daddy, are you sad?" he softly replied. "Dad is just tired." The little girl looked up, her eyes wide. "Mom wouldn't like such a sad house." Alexander paused. He looked around. White walls, clean floors, dim yellow ceiling lights. Everything was so perfect it was almost artificial. He suddenly realized that this cleanliness was the cover he had been looking for, to hide the chaos inside. He was like the woman who had just been thrown out, trying to control everything but his own pain. That night, he could not sleep. The rain fell steadily outside the window, each drop falling into the lake, spreading out in circles. He sat in the dark, the street lights shining on his tired face. In his head, his daughter's words echoed. Mom would not like such a sad house. What did I do wrong? He wondered. He had tried to provide for them, hired the best people, kept his life in order. But why was it all so empty? Was he building a house or a tomb for his memories? Alexander sat there until dawn. His eyes fell on the family photo on the table. Sarah was smiling, her arms around the children. Back then, and the kitchen had been abuzz with batter, laughter, and the smell of burnt coffee. Now, there was only dead perfection. A thought flashed through his mind. Maybe I need someone who knows how to laugh, who knows how to live, who knows how to make this house warm again. He opened his laptop and sent an email to a home services company. It was just one line. Looking for a housekeeper who loves children. He pressed send and leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, the morning mist was covering the bay. In the silver light of dawn, Alexander Cole had no idea that this short letter would be the beginning of something that would change his life and the lives of his children forever. That morning, Seattle was hazy. The wind blowing from the bay over the hills, the deep, steady breathing of a city coming to life. Alexander sat in his office, staring at the long list of candidates sent by the service company. More than 24 names, each with a clean record, good experience, and a perfect smile in his photo. He flipped through the pages, feeling nothing. Everything was too smooth, too cold, like the reports he signed every day. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, then looked up when the doorbell rang downstairs. The temporary housekeeper's footsteps echoed steadily, and then her voice called out, "Mr. Cole, the next candidate has arrived." Alexander looked at his watch. 9 a.m. He took a breath, stood up, and walked out of the quiet room. The hallway was as bright and cold as ever. As he walked down, the light from the glass windows cast pale white streaks on the floor. In the living room, a woman stood waiting. She wore a light blue uniform, an old white apron neatly folded. Her brown hair was tied back at the nape of her neck, a few strands fallen loosely on either side of her cheeks. She wore no makeup, but there was something about her eyes that made it impossible to look away. Warm, brown eyes, sad but bright, as if carrying an untold story. Alexander sat down opposite. He opened the file, which contained only a few short lines. Grace Turner, 35, worked at an orphanage in Tacoma. No references. He frowned. "Don't you have a guarantor?" She nodded, her voice small but clear. "No, sir. I can only tell you the truth about myself." He looked at her, his voice calm. "I have heard enough good things from others. Tell me, why do you want to do this job?" Grace was silent for a moment, then replied, without looking down or making any attempt to defend herself, because I know how silence can kill people. "I used to live in a place where there was only silence, and I don't want anyone else to experience that, especially children." Her voice was as soft as a breath, but enough to make Alexander look up. She continued, "I don't have any advanced degrees or special skills, but I know how to listen. I believe that a house is only truly alive when the people inside it laugh." The living room fell silent. Ethan, Liam, and Ellie stood in the corner of the stairs, watching. Ellie whispered, "Will you choose her?" Ethan shook his head. "You don't choose easily." But when they saw their father's eyes, all three held their breaths. It was no longer a cold, searching look, but something hard to name, as if he had heard an echo from deep within himself. Alexander nodded slightly. "You can start tomorrow. 1-week trial." Grace bowed her head in thanks, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you. I will try my best." The next afternoon, when Alexander left for work, he found her in the kitchen. She was teaching Ellie how to pour batter into a pan. She giggled when the batter splattered on her shirt. Grace didn't scold her, just smiled and gently wiped her nose with a napkin. "Now, little chef, you can do it." He walked out the door, that clear laughter still ringing in his head, a sound the house had long forgotten. Over the next few days, Grace gradually became the heartbeat of the house. She woke up early, opened the curtains to let the sunlight in, and played soft music while she cooked. She didn't give orders, just smiled and said, "Who wants to help me fold the blanket?" And, strangely enough, the children raised their hands before they even knew why. At night, she sat down and told them stories, her voice slow and sweet like a lullaby. Alexander passed by the door several times, intending to continue his work, but stopped and listened. The story was nothing special, just the story of a lost bird finding its way back to the sky, but her voice made everything different. There was a gentleness in it that he thought he would never hear again. One night, he was in his study when he heard laughter echoing from the kitchen. He walked out and stopped at the top of the stairs. Grace and the 3 children were playing a word game. All 4 of them were laughing hysterically when Ellie guessed wrong. He looked at them, the light from the room reflecting off their happy faces. It was a simple sight, but it made his heart sink. Something was changing in the house, and in him. On the 5th day, when he came home late, the children were still awake. Grace and the children were making a memory box for their mother. Inside were drawings, scribbled notes, and an old photo. Ethan carefully taped the box with the words, "To remember that we are still family." Grace looked at them quietly, then said, "Your mother must be proud." That made Alexander stop in the doorway. He turned away, not letting anyone see his eyes moisten. The next morning, he met Grace in the backyard. She was watering the flowers, the sunlight shining on her hair, making it shine honey-colored. He stepped closer, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you. I don't say much, but I can see. You're making them smile again." Grace smiled. Laughing is the easiest way to survive sadness. "Sir." Alexander nodded, about to leave, but then stopped. He asked, almost unconsciously, "Have you ever lost someone?" She was silent for a moment, her eyes looking into the distance, where the sky and the sea merged. "Yes, the person I loved the most." The answer was short, but contained something he didn't dare ask more about. That afternoon, for the first time in a year, Alexander left work early. He picked up some groceries and headed home. When he opened the door, he heard laughter. Not a loud noise, but real, natural laughter that echoed through the hallway. He stood there, smiling, without even realizing it. The once cold house now seemed to breathe, and he knew that the woman named Grace Turner was bringing him something he had lost for so long: life. But at the end of the day, as he passed the laundry room, he heard Grace whispering on the phone, "I don't have enough money yet, but I'll send it soon. Don't worry." Her voice was small and trembling slightly. He paused, his heart clenching for a moment. A vague doubt crept into his heart. He said nothing, just stood there. That night, when the lights in the room were off, Alexander was still sitting by the window, the moonlight reflecting on his pensive face. Little did he know that this small sentence would be the beginning of a series of misunderstandings, and also the path that would lead him to the biggest lesson of his life. A week had passed since Grace arrived, and the magic had quietly taken place. The house on the hill that had once echoed with the wind and the ticking of clocks now had other sounds: spoons clinking against bowls, giggles, and sometimes Grace's soft singing. In the morning, the early sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, shining on Ellie's flour-covered face. Grace was teaching her how to knead bread dough. She leaned over and whispered just enough for Ellie to hear, "You see, if you knead with love, the dough will be softer." Ellie laughed, speaking seriously like an adult. "You're lying. It's softer because you added milk." They both burst out laughing, the sound reverberating throughout the kitchen. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, watching the two of them, his lips curving into a smile, the first real smile in months. Liam was absorbed in his drawing, but occasionally glanced up, his eyes brighter than usual. Alexander stood at the kitchen door, watching the scene for a long time, saying nothing. He didn't want to break the peace, so he just walked away quietly, leaving behind a clear laugh. That afternoon, when he returned from work, he was surprised to see the children arranging flowers in the living room. Grace guided them to cut wildflowers from the garden and put them in simple glass vases. He stood there and said softly, "Wildflowers." Grace looked up, her eyes sparkling in the sunlight. "Yes, I think wildflowers are what make the house come alive. They are not perfect, but full of life." Alexander looked at the small vase of flowers on the table, pale purple flowers interspersed with a few green leaves. He had never thought he needed something so simple, but it felt strange, like a warmth spreading in his chest. That night, the family ate dinner together, a rarity since Sarah's death. Grace didn't sit with them, but she always left a small dessert, apple pie or pudding. For the first time, Alexander ate slowly, not looking at his watch. He listened to Liam talk about the paper airplane he'd made, Ellie show off her drawing of her mother, and Ethan was quiet, but no longer cold. When the meal was over, Grace stepped out to clear the table. He said softly, "Thank you. This house seems to have some air again." She looked at him, her smile as light as the wind. "The air has always been here. You just forgot how to breathe." The words left Alexander speechless. He had never thought about it, but it was true. He had forgotten how to breathe in his own home. One afternoon, a light rain fell. Grace put on her raincoats and went out into the backyard to play. They ran around, jumped in puddles, and laughed. From the study window, Alexander watched Grace pick up Ellie and spin her around in the rain. Her shirt was soaked, her hair stuck to her cheeks, but she smiled brightly, a smile so natural, so alive. He laughed suddenly, then sighed, a sigh that released a buried heaviness. That night, he went to the kitchen late. She was wiping the table when she heard footsteps and turned around. He looked at her and asked softly, "Aren't you afraid of the rain?" She replied calmly, "I've lived for many years in the rain. When someone is willing to stand in the rain with me, I feel alive." He didn't ask any more. There was something in her words that troubled him. Rain, loneliness, life. She seemed to understand the things he had been avoiding. Over the next few days, they talked more about little things, food, music, the way Seattle changed with each season. Grace didn't talk about herself, but her words were genuine and comforting. Alexander began to feel relieved to hear her say even, "Good morning." But then, one night, he heard another strange phone call. Grace stood in the backyard, her voice low. "I know, but you have to understand. I can't let them go hungry." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She continued, "I just need a little more time. Please don't come here." Alexander stood in the doorway, speechless. Those words were like a needle stabbing into his growing suspicion. What was she hiding? Was she lying? He had been betrayed in business and had lost trust in others. Now, that fragile trust was shaken again. The next morning, he watched her more closely. Grace was still smiling, still teaching the children to fold paper cranes, still watering the flowers and cooking breakfast as usual. But he noticed that sometimes she stopped and looked into the distance. Her eyes held a sadness that was hard to hide. That afternoon, he called the family service company and asked for more information about her profile. The person in charge said Grace Turner has no clear information. "We only know that she used to volunteer at the orphanage." The profile was sent directly from an acquaintance, not through the system. Alexander was silent. He felt a mixture of worry and curiosity. Was she taking advantage of his trust, or was she hiding a sinful past that night? He couldn't sleep. Images of Grace kept appearing in his mind, her kind eyes, her gentle smile, the way she cared for the children. He didn't want to believe that she was lying, but his rational mind whispered, "You lost Sarah because you trusted someone. Don't let that happen again." The next morning, when Grace went out to the garden to pick flowers, he stood at the window, his eyes pensive. The house was now filled with light, but his heart was dark. He knew that just one small mistake could destroy everything he had just built, and he had no idea that, in just a few days, the truth he was about to discover would not only change the way he looked at Grace, but also make him face himself again, with his past, his pain, and what he had been running away from for so long: love and trust. The rain continued all week, heavy and gloomy like Alexander's mood. The drops of water pounded against the glass of his office window with a loud thud, as if urging him to face something he was trying to avoid. Ever since he heard Grace's phone call, he had become more cautious. Although he remained calm on the outside, he was uneasy on the inside. He wondered, who is she really? Why is she hiding it? Every time he saw her smile at the children, he felt two conflicting emotions: warmth and suspicion. One morning, while he was in a conference call, his phone rang with a strange transaction from the company's secondary account. The amount was small, just a few $100s, sent to an organization in Tacoma, the same city where Grace had worked. His heart sank. He couldn't believe it was a coincidence. He immediately called the finance department to check. They confirmed the transaction was made from your home computer over your private Wi-Fi network. He sat in silence for a few seconds. No one but her had access to the Wi-Fi. A cold thought gripped him. Grace was taking advantage of his trust. In the evening, he came home early. In the living room, the children were gathered around Grace, making cookies. Ellie picked up a piece of dough for him to taste, her eyes sparkling. "Dad," Grace said, "cookies taste better if you smile." That innocent remark made him smile slightly, but the smile only lasted a moment and then faded. He looked at Grace with suspicion. She responded with a gentle smile, unaware of the storm brewing in the man's heart. That night, after the children were asleep, he called her into his study. The dim light reflected off Alexander's stern face. She stood before the desk, her hands clasped together, feeling that something was wrong. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. "Do you know this transaction?" He pointed to the command line displayed on the screen. "Transfer money to Hope Shelter, Tacoma." Grace looked, eyes wide. I know where it is, but no, I didn't do anything with your account." "Really?" His voice was low, even, but cold, because this transaction was made from my home network, from my computer. Grace froze. I didn't touch your computer. I just used my phone to send some money to that center where I used to work." Alexander interrupted. "With whose money? The money I pay you?" At that moment, her eyes darkened. She spoke slowly, choking up. "That was my salary saved. That center takes care of children who have no one to care for them. I used to live there since I was a child." The room fell silent. Outside, the rain fell harder. Grace looked at him, her eyes full of disappointment. "You think I'm using you?" He did not answer. His silence was the answer. Grace took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "It took me years to trust anyone. I have no family, no home, just this job and the kids. But if you believe me to be a liar, then I should go." Alexander watched her turn and leave. His voice was dry. "I didn't tell you to leave. I just want the truth." She turned back, tears rolling down her face. "The truth is, I have nothing but kindness. But perhaps, for you, kindness also needs to be proven on paper." The door closed softly. He sat down in his chair, his hands clenched so tightly that the veins stood out. Part of him wanted to believe her, but part of him was afraid he would lose everything again. He looked out the window outside. Lightning tore across the Seattle sky, illuminating the empty room. The next morning, Grace was gone. The house was unusually quiet. There was no smell of baked goods at breakfast, and only a few glasses of cold milk remained on the table. The children sat still, their faces blank. Ethan asked, "Dad, where is Grace?" Alexander did not answer. Ellie asked urgently, "You said you would teach me how to make apple pie today." Liam lowered his head and said in a small voice, "Did you make her sad?" Alexander wanted to explain, but his throat was tight. All he could say was, "She has to go away for a while." That lifeless answer chilled the room. The days passed heavily. Alexander worked in silence, but his mind was in turmoil. He missed her smile, her warm voice, the way she looked at his children with such tenderness. She had given them life, and then gone like the wind. At night, he couldn't stand it anymore. He opened his laptop and searched for Hope Shelter, Tacoma. The website that appeared was old and showed a list of orphanage projects. Under principal sponsor, he saw a name, Grace Turner, a volunteer and former orphan there. Below it, there is a caption. She often sends money to help new children entering the center. His eyes blurred. The doubts, the fears, the pride, all of it collapsed in that moment. He jumped up and walked quickly down the hallway. The house was quiet, empty, as it had always been, and he realized he had just chased away the only person who had made this place alive. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking at his father. "Will you take Grace home?" Alexander didn't answer right away. He bent down and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I'll try. Ethan, I'll find her." That night, for the first time in years, Alexander drove in the rain, not for work, but for his heart. The drive from Seattle to Tacoma was longer than he remembered. The rain pounded on the windshield, harmonizing with the heavy beat of his heart. He didn't know if he would find her, but this time he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to lose anyone else because of his own fear. Outside, thunder rumbled again, but inside Alexander, a small light flickered, faint but real. The Seattle night rain seemed to never end. Heavy raindrops pelted the hood, reflecting the yellow lights of the city. Alexander drove alone through the rain, his hands gripping the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that if he didn't find her, he would never forgive himself. The drive from Seattle to Tacoma was about 40 miles, but that night it seemed like an eternity to him. The rain blurred everything, the streets, the signs, the memories. He remembered the morning the kids had asked, "Will you take her home?" and Ethan's expectant eyes haunted him. It was the look Sarah had had when she wanted him there. At 10:45, he reached the outskirts of Tacoma. The back streets were damp, the neon lights flickered, and the late-night eateries were sparsely populated. He stopped on the side of the road and asked a woman with an umbrella, "Excuse me, do you know where Hope Shelter is?" The woman pointed at the end of that road, past the small church. "You will see an old wooden sign." He thanked her and continued driving. When the car stopped in front of a 2-story gray brick building with a crooked wooden sign reading Hope Shelter, his heart suddenly pounded. Everything here was a far cry from the luxurious world he lived in, but one thing he felt was clear. The truth was very near. He walked in. The interior was simple, with pale yellow walls, a few old tables and chairs, and the sound of children's laughter echoing from behind. An elderly woman looked up, looking at him in surprise. The woman smiled kindly. She just got back. She's in the infirmary, taking care of some kids with colds. Hearing this, Alexander felt a strange feeling rising in his chest. He followed her directions, through the narrow corridor filled with children's drawings. At the end of the corridor, through a half-open door, he saw Grace, still in her old uniform, her hair tied low, bending down to cover a little girl with a blanket. He stood still. The sight made all his doubts, anger and pride melt away. In that moment, all he saw was a man, honest, gentle, and strong. When she turned back and met his eyes, everything stopped. She was stunned, then softly said, "What are you doing here?" He walked in, his voice low and slow. "I came to apologize." She was silent, her eyes filled with weariness. "No need, Mr. Cole. I'm used to it. People don't trust me." He took a step further, but I was different. I believed, and then let fear destroy it. She turned away, wiping away a tear. He took a step further, but I was different. I believed, and then let fear destroy it. She turned away, wiping away a tear. Do you think an apology can erase the hurt I used to think I was strong enough to not care? But this is different. I love my children like my own flesh and blood, and when you doubt me, I feel like my family has been taken away from me all over again. Alexander was silent. Family again. Grace sat down, her eyes looking far away. I grew up here, in this facility. My mother left when I was 3, and my father never came back. When I was 14, I saw a couple come to adopt. They chose another child. That's when I realized sometimes people don't need to know the truth. They just believe the easiest thing to believe. Her voice was shaky, but calm. I promised myself that if someone ever needed me, I wouldn't abandon them. I thought I found it at your house, where the children laughed again, where you started smiling, but then you looked at me like I was a thief. Alexander knelt before her. "Grace, I was wrong. I let my past control me. I lost Sarah because I wasn't there, and now I almost lost the person who made my child love again." The room was silent. Only the sound of rain falling lightly on the tin roof could be heard. Grace looked at him for a long time. There was still sadness in her eyes, but there was also a small ray of light. "Do you know where I sent the money?" He nodded. "For this center, I know." She smiled, a tired but warm smile. "Those kids, they don't need much. They just need to know that someone believes in them, even if just once." He gently took her hand, warm and small and trembling slightly. "Then let me trust you again. Not because I need a babysitter, but because I need you here for the children, and for me." She looked at him, her eyes confused. A boy from the center ran over, his voice clear. "Miss Grace, the bread is burnt." She laughed, stood up, then looked at Alexander. "If you want to talk more, wait a few minutes." He nodded, his eyes following her as she walked down the hallway. It was a walk he knew, light but strong, as if each step brought hope to someone. When she returned, he was waiting with an umbrella. He opened it and said softly, Let's go home." She hesitated. "What about the children here? They will still have me," he replied. "I will fund this center. I want to do what you have done for years, give shelter to lost hearts. For the first time." Grace looked at him for a long time, her eyes shining with something that was no longer distant. Perhaps it was trust, or perhaps it was forgiveness. Outside, the rain was still falling, but it seemed lighter. They stepped out together, sharing a small umbrella. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for that moment, the sky over Tacoma seemed a little brighter. The sky in Seattle was lightening as they drove back. The rain had stopped, leaving only a thin mist on the windshield. Alexander glanced over from the driver's seat. Grace sat still, her hands clasped in her lap. Her face was soft, but her eyes still held a hesitant look. He said nothing, only occasionally meeting her gaze, as if afraid that if he spoke, the dream would vanish. As the car drove over the large bridge spanning Puget Sound, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds and shone on the sparkling water. Grace looked out the window and said softly, "Seattle is so beautiful today. Maybe because it was the first time I saw it with different eyes," he replied in a low voice. She turned slightly, surprised. He smiled. "Before, I only saw the city through numbers, reports, contracts, but this morning, I saw it alive, just like me." That sentence softened the atmosphere in the car, a silence as soft as a breath. Grace paused as the car stopped in front of the villa. The white house on the hill was still the same, elegant, quiet, but now it seemed a little warmer, as if it was waiting for them to return. Alexander opened the door and turned. "I'm not forcing you to stay, Grace, but there are 3 children in there who have been waiting for you every day." She stood still for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. "I know. I miss them." He smiled and opened the door for her. The front door opened. Small footsteps echoed down the stairs. Ethan was the first to reach it. He stopped, then shouted, "Miss Grace," within seconds. All 3 of them rushed over and hugged her. Liam was crying and laughing. "Where did you leave us?" Ellie was sniffling. Her voice choked. "I thought you were never coming back." Grace knelt down and put her arms around all 3 of them. Her voice was trembling. "I'm sorry. I missed you so much." Alexander stood behind, watching the scene, his eyes softening. He knew he had just brought warmth back to this house, not with money, but with faith. From that day on, things seemed different. Breakfast was no longer silent. Ethan helped her make coffee, Liam cut fruit, and Ellie drew flowers on the little menu on the fridge. Grace played music every morning, the soft music Sarah had loved. Alexander began spending more time at home. He took the kids to school and occasionally went into the kitchen to help Grace prepare dinner. At first, he was clumsy, spilling a jar of flour. She laughed. "Mr. Cole, you should let me do that." He replied, "You still call me sir? I think we're past that." She smiled, her voice small. "Habits are hard to break. So let's start quitting today." The house seemed to be filled with new life, laughter, footsteps, the piano Grace played that evening. All of it blended into a gentle melody. But the biggest change was in Alexander. He stopped wearing his headset for meetings and stopped burying his head in his laptop screen. He learned to listen, look at his son, and smile. One afternoon, he found an old family photo in a drawer. He took it into the living room and placed it on the fireplace. Under the frame was a new picture, a drawing by Ellie. In the picture, there were 4 people, him, the 3 children, and Grace, standing in the middle of a flower garden. Scrawled underneath were the words, "Our family now." He was silent. He knew what it meant without asking. That night, after the children were asleep, he went out into the backyard. Grace was watering the flowers, the small light illuminating her face. He walked over and said softly, "I saw Ellie's drawing." She smiled slightly without turning back. "She loves to draw." "Yes," he replied, but this time it left no blank space in the picture. Grace looked up at him. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, his voice slow. "The first time I saw Ellie's painting, the spot for her mother was empty. But now, you're there." A gentle breeze blew by, her hair fluttered, her eyes gleamed with warmth. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked. "Afraid of loving again and losing it?" He smiled sadly. "I am afraid. But I have learned this. Fear cannot hold anyone. Only love can." They stood still, listening to the sound of insects in the night, the distant sound of waves in the bay, a peaceful silence. The next day, Alexander took the kids to the Hope Shelter in Tacoma. He said he wanted them to see where Grace had lived. In the car, Ellie sat on Grace's lap, singing and laughing. Ethan looked out the window and said softly, "Auntie Grace, I think Mom in heaven will be happy, because you helped Dad smile again." The words made everyone silent for a few seconds. Grace put her hand on his shoulder. Her voice choked. "Thank you, Ethan." When they arrived at the center, children rushed out to greet Grace. A little girl ran up to hug her, shouting, "Miss Grace is back." Alexander stood watching, a gentle smile on his lips. He understood why she loved this place, because here, people lived with their hearts. That afternoon, he signed the official donation agreement for the center. The money he spent was not to make amends, but to extend the love she had sown. The manager said emotionally, "Cole, this center exists because of people like Grace. Thank you for believing in what she believed." On the way back, the sky turned purple. The sunset covered the brilliant city of Seattle, reflecting through the car window. Grace tilted her head, looked into the distance, and said softly, "I used to think I would never have a place to belong, but now, maybe I have found one." He turned and replied softly, "Not maybe. You found it?" They were silent, but between them, something was said without words, an acceptance, a beginning, and a very real feeling that house was finally smiling. Summer arrived early. Seattle was sunny. The rains had receded, leaving clear blue skies. The Cole house glowed in the morning light. Birds were chirping on the porch. The scent of baked goods mixed with the scent of coffee in the air. Grace stood in the kitchen, her brown hair tied back, carefully sprinkling sugar on the apple pie. Outside, Alexander was helping Liam build a model car, while Ethan was guiding Ellie through the small flower pots by the window. Gone was the cold image of her father in his black suit. Now he wore a simple shirt, the sleeves rolled up, his eyes filled with peace. She smiled and looked out the window. "I never knew he was so clumsy," she said softly. From behind, Alexander's voice rang out, "I heard that." She turned around in surprise and saw him leaning against the doorframe, holding a cup of coffee, smiling gently. "When did you come back?" "Since you were smiling to yourself," he replied. "You looked happy. Maybe because for the first time I felt truly at peace." He put his coffee cup down on the table and walked closer. "Grace, I used to think peace was when you had everything under control, but now I understand. Peace is when someone makes you forget how hurt you were." She looked at him, her eyes warm but hesitant. "Aren't you afraid that the past will repeat itself?" He shook his head slightly. "If I had, I would have chosen differently this time. I wouldn't let fear take away what's most important. You and the children." Outside, the children's laughter echoed, mingling with the distant sound of waves from the bay. The atmosphere made everything seem real and familiar. A week later, Alexander took his family to Hope Shelter, not just to visit this time. The entire downtown area was preparing to open a new building, the Light Home. The silver letters were etched into the stone, shining. Grace looked at the sign, her eyes filling with tears. The old woman in charge spoke up, thanks to the kindness of Mr. Alexander and Ms. Grace. This center can now welcome dozens more children. We call this place the House of Light, because you two have brought light back to the souls that seemed unable to believe in anyone. The whole stadium erupted in applause. Ethan and Liam ran to pull Grace onto the stage. Ellie handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers. "You are my hero." She laughed through her tears. "No, my dear, heroes are all those who dare to believe in goodness, even just once." Alexander stood below, looking at her. In the sunlight, her face was brighter than ever. He knew, in that moment, that she truly belonged here, and to him. When she returned home that evening, the children were already fast asleep. The house was quiet, except for the flickering fire in the fireplace. Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine and handed them to her. "You look great today," he said, his voice soft. Grace smiled, her eyes distant. "I never thought I would ever be called a hero." "You are our hero," he replied, "not because you saved anyone, but because you made us all learn to live again." There was a slight pause. She put her glass down on the table and looked straight at him. "Alexander, I don't know if I deserve this. I was just a helpless girl." He stepped forward and gently took her hand. "Grace, you deserve it, because you not only found your own home, but you helped others find theirs. And he paused, his voice choking, "You are my home." She was silent. The words were not flowery, but they sounded like a promise. He leaned down and placed a light kiss on her forehead. Not hasty, not intense, just a deep touch, enough for 2 hearts to know that they had reached their destination. Life was smooth sailing for a while. Alexander still ran the company, but now he had more balance. He spent time with the children, going to the center with Grace every weekend. Together, they organized free lessons for the orphans, teaching them how to use computers, draw, and, most importantly, to believe they could dream. One late autumn afternoon, Grace stood on the porch, watching the yellow leaves fall on the stone path. Alexander came over and put his coat on her. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "If one day I am no longer here," he interrupted, gently squeezing her shoulder, "Don't say that. But if that happens, I will still live the way you taught me. Believe in the good." She smiled. "Then I'm relieved." At that moment, the sunset shone through the glass window, reflecting on their faces. In that peaceful space, we could clearly feel old wounds had closed, giving way to something simple but lasting: love and faith. A year later, Hope Shelter opened 2 new buildings. Alexander sponsored them but asked that his name not be used. Instead, He wanted the only plaque engraved with the words, "For those who have lost their way, but still believe in the light." The night of the dedication, when they returned home, the family gathered around the dinner table. Ellie brought a little card she had made herself. "This is for you and Grace." She opened it. Inside were scribbled words. "Thank you for teaching me that everyone deserves love. I love you. Dad, I love you. Grace." Alexander looked at the words and felt choked up. He bent down, held his daughter in his arms, and looked at Grace. There was something sacred and simple in those eyes, a feeling he had been searching for all his life, wholeness. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Alexander sat alone on the porch, looking up at the starry sky. The breeze was gentle, and the scent of apple pie lingered from the kitchen. He smiled slightly, remembering what Grace had said, "If you just believe, the light will always find its way back." He whispered softly, as if talking to himself, "Thank you for coming back." In that house on the hill, light does not come from the fireplace alone. It comes from broken hearts coming together to rekindle faith. And in a world of great change, one thing remains constant. When people learn to love and forgive, every home can become a home of light. The story, Billionaire arrives home, early and can't believe. His own eyes is not just a lonely billionaire's journey of redemption. It is a mirror reflecting simple but profound things in life that money can buy a roof, but cannot buy the warmth of a home. Alexander believed that controlling everything was the way to avoid being hurt, but he eventually realized only when we dare to trust and love can we truly live. Grace, the woman who was abandoned, taught him a lesson in kindness and faith. She healed not only him, but also the children in that house and us, who have forgotten that love always has the power to heal. The story reminds us that no matter how old you are, no matter what kind of pain you have been through, it is never too late to start over. With just a little faith, a little goodwill, you can brighten up your life and the lives of others. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of the story. If you feel something touching your heart, please click like, share this story to spread love, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotional stories. Because sometimes, just one story is enough to change a heart.